Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. Okay, Watsuji's Ethics. So we're in part 3, the spatio-temporal structure of a human being. This week, today, we're looking at chapters 12 and 13. So these are the 5th and 6th chapters of this part. There's only one left after this, and that'll be the next video, and that will be us for this series. So let's jump into chapter 12, the acts of Ningen. Okay, so just remember that word Ningen. We're going to talk about it. I'll start using it more actually in this video as well. Ningen Sonzai. So basically just human being. But it's actually, I realized while I was preparing for this, Ningen Sonzai is kind of like Watsuji's word for Dasein. It's the same kind of thing, and he's trying to do the same kind of thing that Heidegger did by using Dasein. So he's Ningen Sonzai. It's a way of thinking of human beings, but with that emphasis on our dual nature as individual and social, bringing in that his idea of inbetweenness and emphasizing spatiality over temporality, or in addition to temporality. So that's all it is when I use the word Ningen or Ningen Sonzai. That's what I'm meaning. It's like a Watsuji's version of Dasein, but emphasizing something different from what Dasein was emphasizing. The point of the word Dasein, anyway. Okay, so the acts. What are acts? That's what this chapter is going to look at. And the central thing to keep in mind here is that, again, human beings are spatio-temporal beings whose central feature is that in-betweenness. So we're focusing on here acts within this kind of domain of practical interconnection, the social relations, community acts within that kind of with that flavor, with that tenor to them. And so when Watsuji talks about an act, when he defines an act, that is what we are keeping in mind, the spatio-temporal structure of human beings, Ningen Sonzai. So the first thing that defines an act, he says, is it's fundamentally an interactivity between subjects. And this is the spatial side of an act. So it's not something that an individual can do alone with objects, with things. And Watsuji's example is eating. So you can eat alone, but to do that and to think of that as an act is more like an abstraction of a genuine act, because it's denying this first defining feature, interactivity between subjects. So an act in terms of eating is a communal thing, eating with other people, which involves conventions and norms and required acts. There's a whole package of behavior that comes with this kind of interactivity, and it's that's central to an act for Watsuji. So this necessarily requires techniques. He uses that word techniques, and all techniques have been developed socially. So again, just drawing everything back to this notion of in-betweenness, which means that, and I've kind of hinted at this already, an individual in isolation doesn't act, or can't even act. That's not it's not a genuine act for Watsuji. So thinking of a person as an isolated individual, thinking of an act as something an isolated individual does, is for Watsuji an abstraction. It's something that, yeah, you can think about it, you can even do it, but it's not fundamental. It's something that it's derived from this more originary kind of act, which necessarily involves interactivity between subjects. Another thing that's interesting about this is that it doesn't need to be volitional. So an act doesn't have to be intentional. Even accidents for Watsuji are still acts. And this is because of that focus on in-betweenness. Simply by being next to others, we're burdened with various forms of activity. And if we do them, if we don't do them, whether intentional or not, then it's still something we do in our interactivity with others, even if we didn't deliberately do it. And he talks about standing on someone's foot by mistake. Even though you didn't intentionally do it, you have done it within this sphere of in-betweenness. You have done something as part of your interactivity with other people. Or the act takes place within this sphere of in-betweenness. So it still has that practical that sense of practical interconnection. It's still, and that's what's important. More so than that you deliberately intended something, what's important here is that it relates back to this interactivity between subjects. So stepping on someone's foot, sure, you didn't intend to do it, so it's not like you wouldn't blame someone for it, but it's still an act in the full sense of the word for Watsuji, because it takes place within this sphere of in-betweenness. So he says, simply by being next to others, we're burdened with various forms of activity, and the prohibition against inconveniencing other people is one of those. And so when that happens, it's an act, and like I say, it's not, you're not bad for doing it. It was unintentional, but it's still an act. It still qualifies as an act, because what's important is not the individual attitude in isolation. What's important is the group, the practical interconnections between subjects in that group. And another consequence of this is that infants don't act, because they don't stand in practical relationships with others as individuals. What we recognize in infants is the possibility of them becoming individuals. So that's great as well, that's fine. So that's the first defining feature of an act. It's an interactivity between subjects. That's its spatial dimension. The second defining feature of an act is that it's a gesture which aims to establish possible human relations. So this is the temporal dimension of an act. And here, Watsuji says that our interactions with others are predicated on and determined by our past associations with them. So all of our actions take place within, they don't arise from nothing, they don't appear out of nowhere, they have a history, a background, and obviously this is the past, the aspect of the past here. And this even stretches as far as with strangers with whom we have maybe no background or no history, because that in itself is still the absence of a past association is still a background against which our actions will proceed. So even when there has been no past interactions with someone, that itself is still a background feature, or a kind of horizon against which our present acts will follow. And also, all of our interactions aim at some possible interrelation yet to be realized. And this is obviously the futural aspect. And Watsuji calls this motivation or purpose. So those two features define an act: interactivity between subjects, that's our spatial dimension, and a gesture which aims to establish possible human relations, and that's our temporal dimension. So this is different from the way other philosophers have approached the subject of acts, and Watsuji specifically mentions Kant and Scheller here, and this is because they've all treated the foundational element of a human being as the individual in isolation, a mind, a consciousness, an ego, whatever it is. They've all treated that as primary, and that's affected how they see everything, in fact. But in this case, it's affected the way that they define what an act is. Watsuji has that broader grounding of inbetweenness, and so his definition of act follows that. Nice, and that is chapter 12. So let's move into chapter 13, which is trust and truth. All right, so we start here by asking, what is trust? So Watsuji says that this is an expectation we have regarding the behavior of others. And what's important about this is that this is an expectation we have before we know anything about them, before there is an actual concrete relation. This foundation of trust is already there. So what's important to recognize here, and I don't think Watsuji makes it clear, in the same way we saw that kind of split between the phenomenological and the metaphysical a few videos back. We've got the same kind of thing in this chapter. There's a little bit of ambiguity between, and there's no word for it in Watsuji either, but it's an ambiguity between the ontological and the ontic. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit in the video, and that's a reference right back to Heidegger. And it's no surprise that comes up in Watsuji, because he is very much picking up from Heidegger, taking on a lot of Heidegger's ideas. So yeah, we've got this. So the ontological ontic split is very relevant, even though Watsuji doesn't make anything of it and he doesn't mention it. But I think if you're not aware of it, this could be confusing. So let's just go back to this idea: trust. It's an expectation we have regarding the behavior of others, but it's not about certain things. It's not about specific things they might have said or done. So trust is not an expectation you have based on what someone said. That's an ontic level of trust. The level of trust that we're talking about now, and so ontic, if you're not familiar with Heidegger, is kind of the everyday practical, what's the word I'm looking for? Particular examples, particular instances of behaviors or acts. Those would be ontic. What we're looking for here is ontological, related to the structure of human existence, human being. And so that's the level that Watsuji's approaching this topic from, trust. It's an expectation we have regarding the behavior of others, but not at the level of specific instances of words or deeds. It's at this deeper level of more foundational level, this ontological level concerning human existence itself, the existence of our in-betweenness. That's kind of the level where we need to think about when we're trying to understand Watsuji on trust. So we recognize others then as beings with whom we trust we can have a relationship. And that's the essence of the word trust here. It's at that level, like I said before, that in-betweenness. Before we actually engage in specific ways with people, there is this deeper grounding of in-betweenness. And within that, we have expectations of others that they, not that they will do what they say or that they will, because they haven't said anything yet, but that they will, but that we can stand in this relationship with them, that we can have this relationship of in-betweenness with them. And so we have that expectation of other people, whereas we don't have that same expectation towards other things, right? If you're outside and there's a tree next to you, you don't have an expectation of any kind of practical interconnectivity you might be able to share with a tree, right? There is no sense of that kind of what we're calling here in-betweenness. It doesn't arise. So there is no sense in which we can talk about trust in your relationship with a tree, to the extent that we can even talk about your relationship with a tree. So it's that expectation beneath. It's the expectation that we can have those ontic expectations at that higher level. That's what we're talking about. This ontological grounding. So we always already. That's a Heideggerian term. We always already stand in a relation of trust to other people. And that's this deeper ontological grounding that Watsuji's talking about. After that, then it can be abused or rejected or upheld. But we have to have that deeper grounding of trust first. As he says, maliciousness could not occur without this prior trust. And again, he's really conflating the two there, I think, because maliciousness is really an ontic. He's talking in ontic terms. And the trust that he's talking about, the prior trust, is really ontological. So there is a bit of conflation here, and you do need to be aware of it to make sense of this, I think. So basically, trust is our originary attitude towards others within that ambit of in-betweenness. That's really that's the glue of Watsuji's philosophy, in-betweenness. And so trust is that expectation we have regarding the behavior of others before they've actually done anything, before we have any particular, practical, specific interactions with them. So then he asks, what is the ground of trust? What is trust grounded in? And his first thought is that trust requires a certain socialization. It requires people acting within a community according to rules and with a kind of a rational will, so that they're not merely succumbing to impulse, is what Watsuji says. So they're not just acting selfishly. So they're able to think about other people, and we're able to live harmoniously in a society. Yes, that is true. You need that You need a certain level of socialization for trust to occur. But it's not deep enough for Watsuji. He wants to go beneath that. So trust is grounded, he says, in assuming in advance an attitude towards the future, an attitude which is therefore based also on the past. So trust is grounded in assuming an attitude towards the future which is based on the past. So the present act then always takes place from a presumed identity of past and future, where past and future are previous human relations and possible human relations. So the established in the past and the possible in the future, they're both the same in the sense that they are human relations. So and that's how Watsuji's getting this. The present act takes place from the presumed identity of past and future, an attitude based on the past towards the future, in which those things are human relations. And this is exactly how we describe the temporal nature of human beings. We talked about this in the last video, is that kind of home ground. The past was an established home ground, and where we're moving towards in the future is a possible home ground, but they're both, the core of both is that in-betweenness, practical interconnection, human relations. So there is that identity. And since there's no temporality without spatiality, those two are interlinked, then trust is grounded in the spatio-temporal nature of Ningen Sonzai. And that's the final goal here. So trust is grounded in the fundamental nature of human beings. Spatio-temporal, that dual negation, that double movement of negation, in-betweenness, practical interconnectedness, all of these things come together here. And that's what, but the important thing is that that's what grounds trust for Watsuji. It's what trust is grounded in, the fundamental nature of human beings. Nothing else. It's not grounded in anything outside of human beings. It's not something independent of us or objective. It's grounded in what it is to be a human being. And that's kind of, it's exactly the same thing that we see in Heidegger as well. Everything grounds back in Dasein. It's the same idea here. Everything grounds itself in Ningen Sonzai. That's the starting point. And that's why I said Watsuji is fundamentally phenomenological. His philosophy is fundamentally phenomenological, or / ontological. It's really the same kind of thing. That it's the same kind of project as Heidegger, but just with the emphasis on space and community rather than an individual, Dasein, and time. So what Watsuji says about this then is that saying human relationships are built on trust is actually wrong, because in truth, both human relations and trust are grounded in the law of Ningen Sonzai, that fundamental nature of human beings. So human relations and trust are kind of on the same level, both grounded in this law of Ningen Sonzai, this spatio-temporal nature, the double negation, the movement of that double negation, in-betweenness, space, time. That's what grounds these things. So, yeah, human relationships aren't built on trust. Human relationships and trust are both built on this fundamental law of Ningen Sonzai. So if everything we've just talked about is true, if human relationships are always formed in trust, if trust is always already that originary grounding on which human relationships are formed, how can trust be deprived then? How can we talk about falsehood if trust is this kind of ontological pre-existing? I don't know. That's probably not the right word, but it's the ontological base on which everything ontic takes place afterwards. If it's already there, if it's always there first, how can we talk about depriving trust? How can we talk about falsehood? To answer that question, Watsuji is going to pivot a little bit and talk about truthfulness. So when we talk about truthfulness, there are three traditional ways of understanding this. The first is as correspondence between thought and object. So if what you think corresponds with what actually is the case in the external world, then what you have thought was true. What you thought was true. That's a very common way that philosophers often think about truthfulness. The problem for Watsuji is that it's purely, he says, contemplative. It's a very disengaged, disinterested kind of approach to the word truthfulness. And in essence, it's more metaphysical than anything. And so it's missing the essence of what the word truthfulness is getting at. You can't. It's just not. Truthfulness is more essential to human existence than that. It has no place really in these kinds of disengaged discussions about the way that external reality is in relation to your opinion about it or thoughts about it. This is too, like I say, too disengaged, too metaphysical for Watsuji here. So truthfulness is more, it's more intrinsically connected to a lived life rather than this kind of, I hesitate to use the word, but I guess it's right, this more abstract way of thinking, more abstract metaphysical approach. So this idea of truthfulness, correspondence between thought and object, that's out. Another way that it's typically been thought of is as the congruence of word and fact. So this is very similar, but we've already talked about the correspondence of thought and object as kind of an external reality. So when we're talking about word and fact now, let's forget about objective facts, which is really just rehashing the first way of thinking here, correspondence between thought and object. So dispense with objective facts. Let's talk about congruence of word and fact from a more a human situation. So consider a lie, Watsuji says. Imagine someone tells a lie, but due to their own ignorance, the fact that they misbelieve something, they end up telling the truth. In that situation, Watsuji asks, did they lie? They intended to tell a lie, but because they didn't understand the situation properly, they ended up telling the truth. Did they lie? Most of us, I think, would say yes, they did. And why? They lied because their intention was to deceive, right? Their attitude of mind towards the person with whom they were talking was one of deception. They wanted to mislead. Which means then that the fact that their word and the fact of the matter were the same, were correct, is irrelevant. When we think about truthfulness, we're not interested in the actual words that are spoken and the facts. That's not what interests us here, as this example shows, because those two things they align in this case. The word, which was intended to be a lie, but wasn't, it actually corresponded to the fact. So even though those two things corresponded, we still think this person lied. And that tells us that what's important is the attitude of mind towards other people. And what's not important, what's irrelevant, is the congruence of the word and the fact. That is uninteresting to us when we're thinking about truthfulness. So what's essential here, so what the case is then is relations between human beings decide the issue of truth or falsehood, not the relation between a fact and a word. And he goes on to talk about white lies as well. So white lies, I'm not sure what you think about white lies, whether you think they're deception, if they're genuinely lies, or if you kind of moderate them. We call them white because they're not of any kind of serious consequence usually. Well, they aren't. They have to be. They must not be if they're going to be white lies. But Watsuji says they're a kind of truthfulness actually, because they're directed towards the relation. Right? The intent is whether the word matches the fact is irrelevant. What's important here is that the intention towards the relation. That's what determines truthfulness, as opposed to falsehood. And that relation is grounded in the spatio-temporal essence of human beings, togetherness, inbetweenness, society. All of that stuff comes in here. So when we direct our words towards that with the interest of preserving that, caring for that, then we have truthfulness. Falsehoods are not about incongruences between words and facts, but about our practical relations with others. The third way that we tend to think about truthfulness is as congruence between word and deed. And this we can analyze in exactly the same way that we looked at word and fact when we talked about lies. In this case, we can talk about a promise to do something. What's important here, again, not the words or the fact that the words correspond to the deed, but what's important is that these words and the resultant deed are an expression of human relationships. If they're grounded in this idea of human beings as spatio-temporal, as fundamentally connected in a society or a community, grounded in this in-betweenness, then that's what makes this truthfulness. That's what makes this true, not the fact that there are words and they match the deeds. There is no congruence of words and deed apart from human relationships. So that's what's at the core of this. So truthfulness then for Watsuji is basically the truth of, or the real feature of, a human being. That's where we trace this back. Because the truth of, or the real feature of a human being is that negative structure, that spatio-temporal structure again. The idea that we are not isolated individuals, but we are grounded in this. We're individuals but at the same time we're social, that dual characteristic of what it is to be a human being, in-betweenness, community, that's what the core of truthfulness is for Watsuji. And he says we never talk about truthfulness or sincerity or honesty apart from human relations. And here's an interesting example of a flower. He says even if someone maintained the same attitude towards a flower over the whole lifetime of the flower, we wouldn't call that person sincere. Whereas if someone maintained the same attitude towards their spouse, we would call that person sincere. So yeah, human relations, that's what truthfulness is grounded in. Okay, so let's go back to the original question. How does falsehood arise? If trust is that original grounding, how does falsehood arise? So this gets a little bit tricky maybe, but the idea is that since truth is the real feature of Ningen Sonzai, truth is grounded in that fundamental nature of human beings, what it is to be a human being, spatio-temporal, the in-betweenness, all of that good stuff is in there. Since that's what truth is falsehood the lack of this? Is it some kind of absence of Ningen Sonzai? That is that real essence, that structure, that nature of human being. If that's missing, is that what falsehood is? And Watsuji says, no, that's absurd. This can't be destroyed or eliminated. It's what you are. It's what you are as a human being. There's no, if you weren't that, if you didn't have that, you wouldn't even be a human being. So that's ineradicable. It must be there. But it can't be destroyed, but it can be hidden. And so that's what falsehood is for Watsuji. It's hidden truth. You can't eradicate truth from an ontological standpoint. You can't eradicate truth, but you can hide it. And if falsehood is hidden truth, then it's still truth. This is an interesting idea. If falsehood is hidden truth, it's still truth, just a manner in which truthfulness exists. It's one way in which truthfulness can exist. It can exist as present and open, and as there you're living in accordance with that fundamental nature. But it can also exist as hidden. It's still there, but it's just covered over. That's another way in which this truthfulness, in an ontological sense, the structure of a human being, can be present. Can be present as absent in a way of thinking. You can kind of think about it like that. Kind of twist your way of thinking to get there. So falsehood is not the absence of truth, which is Ningen Sonzai, human relations, in-betweenness, that fundamental nature. It's not the absence of truth because it's impossible for one to not live in a relation of betweenness. It's impossible to not be Ningen Sonzai. Rather, falsehood is the way that truth does not take place in a certain way. Specifically, it's the way that truth, Ningen Sonzai, that fundamental nature, happens, the way that truth happens in the mode of being hidden. And Watsuji also describes this as a halting. Halting as in, and this is a reference back to that double movement of the movement of that double negation, which can be interrupted or halted. So he describes that as halting because that double movement again is Ningen Sonzai. That's that fundamental nature again. brings in all of those aspects of in-betweenness and the individual and the social. So all of that's just as core here. So when we talk about truthfulness being hidden, we can also talk about that double movement being halted or interrupted. And it's the same thing. So that's what falsehood is for Watsuji. Now there are a couple of consequences to this idea. The first is that falsehood lacks subsistence without truthfulness. So truthfulness, as I've already said many times, truthfulness is primary. It's originary. It's what it is to be a human being. And falsehood comes on top of that as the hiddenness of it, or as the halting, the interruption of that movement. And he just goes into a little bit more detail on that. For a lie to be effective as a lie, it must be given as a truth. So that's one way in which falsehood lacks subsistence. There must be this deeper grounding of truthfulness or trust. But just note with that, there is a sudden change to the ontic. We're suddenly talking about an ontic level description here. For a lie to be effective, it must be given as truth. That's a very ontic way of thinking. It's a very ontic example. So just be aware of that. There is a bit of a change there. But we can drop back to the ontological level. For falsehood to arise, that is to say, for truthfulness to be hidden, or for that double movement to be halted, there must be a foundation of truthfulness, or a foundation of that double movement of negation, i.e. in-betweenness. And so no one can commit falsehoods in isolation. And again, there's a kind of a slip to the ontic, but you can't commit a falsehood in isolation. You must be in a community already. You have to be grounded in this deeper truth. So the same applies for societies, not just individuals. And here, when we're talking about societies, the halt or the interruption of this movement of double negation, or this double movement of negation, is when society imposes restraints on an individual's self-awareness. Because the idea with this truth and trust is that we're acting out of this place of understanding of who we are. We're acting out of our fundamental nature as human beings. The spatio-temporal, in-betweenness, practical relations, all of this comes into that. So when we're not acting from that, so if we're in denial, if you like, of that, or we're not aware of that nature, then then the movement is interrupted. Then the truthfulness is hidden. So this can happen at the level of societies, not just individuals. So society has a role to play in this, in kind of facilitating that, not occluding the fundamental nature of human beings as Watsuji is articulating it. Another consequence is that we get an ought out of this. So I'll give you a quote for this. Because a human being's truthfulness has the possibility of not taking place while always and already taking place, it turns out to be something that should take place. This is the ought-oriented characteristic of human truthfulness. So, okay, let's just have a think about that. Human beings' truthfulness has the possibility of not taking place, being hidden, while always and already taking place, because it's ontological, it's originary, it's our original way of being, that must be the case, that is the case just by virtue of us being human beings. So since it has the possibility of not taking place, even though it's always and already taking place, occluding this, hiding this, is wrong. Since it always takes place anyway, since that is our fundamental nature, whether you know it or not, whether you decide to act in accordance with it or not, that is the case. Therefore, hiding that, covering that, denying that is wrong. Wrong in the sense of not recognizing the truth of the matter, denying the truth of the matter. So wrong kind of in an ontological sense. Wrong in the sense that you have, if you're lying or if you deny it, you're denying, it's like a self-denial. You're denying the reality of the situation, what it is to be a human being. If you go against it, again, there's a denial there, a refusal to accept that this is the nature of what it is to be a human being. It's even when you're deliberately going against it, you're kind of you're looking to cover over this fundamental nature. So it's wrong in the sense that it's not being true to the reality of the situation, to what it is to be a human being, to the actual original nature of human beings. And since it's wrong in this way, we can say, in this kind of ontological sense, we can say that we ought not to do it. We ought not to obstruct truthfulness. Again, in an ontological sense, we ought not to hide or reject or deny this fundamental nature, this double movement of negation, this spatio-temporal nature, this inbetweenness. We ought not to cover over that or go against it because it's always there anyway. So because it is the ground, to do anything else, to embrace any other way of being, is a deception. Even if it's only a deception, even if it's only a self-deception, it's wrong in that sense, in this ontological sense, that it's just not the way reality is. Reality as a human being. It's not the way we are. So this is ontological. It's wrong, kind of wrong to hide the truth of human reality, Ningen sonzai. But it carries over into the ontic, right? Because if we recognize that, if we recognize and understand the fundamental nature of human beings as this, as the practical human relations, then that ought can carry over. So we ought to not cover over or hide that or halt that movement. Therefore, we can extend this into specific, particular cases, instances where you might lie, but in lying, you are going against that fundamental nature, which is inbetweenness. You know, if you don't uphold your promise, again, you're violating that fundamental nature, which is grounded in inbetweenness in society. So the way that this is the way that Watsuji in a way gets his ontic ethics out of his ontological understanding. Okay, so I think that about gets us there. So we did get an ought out of that. We'll talk a little bit more detail on good and bad in the last chapter. But I think that kind of covers truthfulness, falsehood, trust. One last thing I would just mention is that you may, if you've read Heidegger, you will notice some massive overlap with Heidegger there. Not so much with Being and Time, but if you've read his 1930, I think it was just an essay on the essence of truth, so many parallels there between Watsuji and Heidegger. The way that he links truth to this ontological dimension, the structure of human existence. That's straight out of Heidegger. This notion of falsehood as the hiddenness of truth. Heidegger calls it concealment. That's all in Heidegger. Another one is the falsehood being grounded in truth, which is kind of a neat move. That's totally taken out from that essay or article on the essence of truth. Heidegger calls it untruth. He says untruth is grounded in truth. And even I realized the way that I mentioned it at the beginning of the video, Dasein. Heidegger uses the word Dasein instead of human beings. Watsuji's got his own version of Dasein with Ningen Sonzai. So there are a lot of parallels to be drawn there. And I mention that not to criticize Watsuji, because, man, how could you criticize anyone for taking up, for following in the footsteps of Heidegger? But, and I mean, I presume that he had read that. It would be an amazing coincidence for him to have put all of this up without having read on the essence of truth. But yeah, like I say, it's not a criticism of Watsuji, because first of all, you can't criticize someone for following in the footsteps of great ideas, but he's added something, because he's got the same kind of framework, but he's approached it through different. He's got different details. So he's got his Ningen Sonzai in relation to Heidegger's Dasein, but like I said at the beginning, this is the reason. The reason for Ningen Sonzai is to focus on inbetweenness and space, as opposed to Heidegger's Dasein, which was the exact opposite, basically. And so all of this comes out with the same essential structure, but with some important differences. And yeah. So, I just thought it's worth to point that out, because that will help with understanding. It's an interesting, it's good. It's good, just good to situate Watsuji, I think. All right, let's hit a summary. So first we looked at the acts of Ningen, and this was, or the essence of acts for Watsuji is that they are connected to inbetweenness. So rooted in that idea of practical relations between subjects. And that's the first. There were two features which defined an act for Watsuji. The first is an interactivity between subjects, and this was the spatial aspect. The second was an act is a gesture which aims to establish possible human relations, and this was the temporal dimension to an act. Both of those differ from the way acts have traditionally been understood, because the focus is on community rather than the individual, an isolated individual. Then we moved on to trust, and trust is an expectation we have towards other people. So the idea, this is kind of an ontological way of thinking about trust. Other people are entities we trust we can have a relationship with. We have this a different relationship with other people than we do with other things, and this is grounded in this expectation we have, this expectation of trust. And this is an originary attitude. It's always present. You can't be a human being and not have this. So it was grounded in the spatio-temporal nature of human beings. Then we looked at truthfulness, and truthfulness is essentially the truth of, or the real feature of, a human being. So the idea is that Watsuji is trying to connect this back to that fundamental nature, the double negation, spatio-temporal, our dual nature as individuals and social, and very much ontological. So this is in opposition to more abstract or disengaged ways of thinking about truthfulness, which missed the mark for Watsuji, because truthfulness is fundamentally connected with other people. Right? We don't talk about, like he says, we don't talk about honesty or sincerity towards a flower, but we do towards other people. And that's the sense in which truthfulness means what it means for Watsuji. So it's grounded in this fundamental nature of human beings. And this led us to falsehood. What is a falsehood? And this turned out to be the way truthfulness happens in the mode of being hidden. So falsehood is still a truth. It's still grounded in truth. It still has the essence of truth, because you can never get rid of truthfulness. Right? It's an ontological imperative. But that ontological reality or truth can be hidden. He also called this the halting of that movement of the double negation. And a couple of consequences. Falsehood always requires truthfulness. It's not original falsehood. It arises on top of this deeper ontological structure. And with this idea of falsehood, we see that we ought not to obstruct truthfulness. So since truthfulness is the ontological reality, and it's always there, whether you tell lies or are honest or not, that grounding is always there. That original structure is always there. So to cover over it, or to hide it, or to act as if it isn't there, as if the reality of human beings were different, is something that we ought not to do. It's a denial of the way the world is, and in that sense, we ought not to do it. And this was then an ontological ought. Although Watsuji doesn't describe it in this way, that's what we have. Nevertheless, we can derive ontic oughts from that, bearing in mind what it is to be a human being, which is that grounded in inbetweenness. Therefore, we can get our ontic oughts from that. We can derive them from this deeper ontological level. And that's it for me today, guys. Thank you for watching. I hope this helped, and I'll see you in the next video where we will wrap up ethics.